Did the president direct you or anyone else to work with Rudy Giuliani on Ukraine?
When was it? There was the May meeting, and I think this has been widely reported. In fact, I think Sondland mentioned it in his testimony, and I'm pretty sure that Rick Perry mentioned it in his interview yesterday with the Wall Street Journal, that in the May meeting in the Oval Office that I was in, I think Senator Johnson was there as well as Mr. Volker was there. The president asked Rick Perry to work with Mr. Giuliani.
All right, put down your remote. Nothing wrong with your television. We just showed you that sound earlier. Now we're looking at it in a different light. Bloomberg reporting that Rick Perry, Secretary of Energy, has just told Donald Trump that he plans to step down soon from his job. As I said, as Energy Secretary, White House officials are not disputing that report to NBC News. They say soon. Exact timing remains unclear. Widely reported that Perry was going to leave by year's end. That's been speculated about for some weeks. It's possible now that this particular member of the three Amigos may be in the departure lounge a little bit sooner. Joining the conversation for this chat, Robert Costa, the national political reporter for the Washington Post. Robert, Rick Perry out the door. What's going on with that?
As we've reported at the Post, Secretary Perry has been moving toward the exit for quite some time. The question now he faces is, will he comply with the congressional subpoena? And maybe he would be in a different position, some of his associates tell us, if he's outside of government, to make a decision on his own rather than worrying about the administration's assertion of executive privilege.
Robert, I'm curious about what you make of Perry's role in all of this. You know, he's now been, as I suggested before, he's part of this Three Amigos as someone kind of running Ukraine policy, kind of off the books, not as part of the normal diplomatic or national security and foreign policy chain. At the same time, the public things that he has said so far seem to suggest, hey, you know what, like, I was involved in this a little bit, and I wanted Trump to talk to the Ukrainians, but not only to talk about energy stuff. I don't have anything to do with the stuff that he's in trouble for. But do we think there's a deeper story here to tell about Rick Perry?
There's always more room to explore and to ask questions. The question I'm asking as a reporter about Secretary Perry is, what was his intent when he interacted with Ukrainian officials about natural gas in Ukraine? We know, based on our reporting, that Rudy Giuliani had his own ideas about how different oil companies should be set up and natural gas companies should be set up in Ukraine, was talking to the president, was talking to Ukrainian friends of his, business associates. But Secretary Perry, as a Secretary of Energy, overlapped at times with some of these conversations. The question Congress will ask him is, was his intent to meddle in Ukrainian politics and business for political reasons, or did he have the intent to simply do so as Energy Secretary?
So, Robert, in the previous block, I talked about how a bunch of people who you thought that the administration might be able to put behind the stone wall, or people who were seen as loyalists to Trump, have, in rapid fire succession over the course of the last week, got on the other side of the stone wall and have turned out to be antagonists of the president, or at least have testified in ways that are damaging to him. If you, on the basis of your reporting, do people inside the administration look at Rick Perry and see someone who is dangerous to the president, or do they think that Rick Perry is kind of still under the president's control?
First of all, they don't really think it's a stone wall. We have a constitutional system. Congress has oversight of the executive, and the White House can assert executive privilege, but many of these officials, whether it's Secretary Perry or members of the national security apparatus, can still put their hand in the air and say, I'm going to testify before Congress if Congress is issuing me a subpoena. And many people involved, when you talk to administration officials, current and former, they want their hands clean here. They see an unfolding situation. Many of them now want to go to Congress to make their own case.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.